It's a pleasure to be here. What I want to do this afternoon is walk you through work that my group has done over about the last 15 years related to the two biggest threats to biodiversity in Southeast Asia. And those are forest destruction and degradation and the wildlife trade, the capture of wild animals for domestic or international purposes. And this work fits in broadly with the theme that guides most of what my research group does, which is tackling this question: how do we protect biodiversity in an increasingly crowded, hot, and hungry world? And our approach to this central question has been increasingly solutions-oriented. That is, rather than simply documenting all the ways in which we are making the world worse for biodiversity, we're trying to think about how we might be able to reduce the threats, find viable solutions to those problems. And one consequence of that is we tend to work a lot at the landscape level. So I'm not going to do very much in the way of discussions of issues at the global or intergalactic levels, in large part because most solutions to environmental problems are enacted at the national or subnational level. I'll talk about fieldwork because I think it is an increasingly important tool for gaining insights on some of these issues. And one of the things you'll see is that the work I've been doing has become increasingly multidisciplinary. And this arises from the fact that if you're trying to solve environmental problems, whatever solutions you propose, if they're gonna work, they have to be scientifically sound, economically sound, and socially acceptable. And so that has been moving us in some different directions in recent years. Two other themes that are going to appear briefly. The first is the idea of research as adaptive management. And I kind of added this because I've been working with graduate students over the last year or two and noticed that hasn't been my experience. And an awful lot of what we've done has really been due to luck and a bit of improvisation. And I kind of want to make that point as well. And then in a couple of points, I'm just going to pause and say, well, if you want to be finding solutions to environmental problems, do the papers make any real difference where it matters, which is on the ground in terms of the management of resources? So let me begin with lucky event number one for me, which was the arrival of the Singaporeans. So Liam Pin Ko, now at Conservation International, joined me as a graduate student in 2004. A few years ago, Sing Lee Giam, now at the University of Tennessee, arrived. And both of them had grown up in Singapore. They were graduates of the National University of Singapore. And when they came to work with me, they said they wanted to explore, in part, as part of their research, what oil palm agriculture was doing to biodiversity in Southeast Asia. Now, at this point, back in 2004, I was completely unaware of this issue. And I had never even, I think I'd been to Asia once for 2 weeks. So I didn't know anything about what they were doing, but why not? And they were aware of something that I should have been aware of, but wasn't, and in fact that most American research groups were unaware of, which was the tremendous degree to which forests across Southeast Asia were being cleared and converted to monocultures of oil palm. And so they wanted to figure out what this was doing to biodiversity. And I thought, all right, sounds interesting, go to it. So Pin, who was the first graduate student, young Pin, tackled this, and there were kind of three main findings that came out of his work. The first was that, in fact, oil palm cultivation was driving most of the deforestation in Southeast Asia. Folks who lived in the area were quite aware that forests were being cleared to grow oil palm, but until this point, no one had really tried to figure out the degree to which oil palm was responsible for deforestation. And so Pin used publicly available data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations over this time period and found that during this 15-year period, in the two global major producers of oil palm, over half of the forest loss could be tied to the cultivation of oil palm. The second thing he documented was that it really is disastrous to biodiversity. And so just to give you an example, plotted here are the number of species of forest-dwelling birds and butterflies in an old-growth or primary forest, and then how many of these species persist in a log forest, a rubber plantation, or ultimately an oil palm plantation. And you can see the tremendous drop in forest species of birds and butterflies when that forest is converted to oil palm. And Pin did this using published data and some of his own field observations. Getting enough feedback here that I'm going to try and go without the lavalier. And if you need me to speak louder, let me know, okay? So neither of these, by the way, are sort of highly unexpected results. Neither of them are shocking. Both of them generated a ton of papers by other researchers using better sources of data, more intensive surveys, more complicated metrics. They all came to the same conclusion, which was that oil palm is a main driver of deforestation, and where it occurs, it's awful. Pin always felt a little bit guilty that he had written this up using these pretty simple metrics and data, but I always reminded him using my own horrible version of John Tukey's famous maxim, far better an approximate answer to the right question if you're first than a precise answer if you're second. And indeed, he was one of the first researchers to get into this. The third thing that Pin found was that there really was no such thing as wildlife-friendly oil palm. You might think of that as an approach to take. So Pin cleverly looked at all the things that the oil palm growers might do, like epiphytes grow up the trunks of the oil palm, allow weeds to grow in the understory. Some of the growers will even put flowering plants of different species into the plantations, and most importantly, leave patches of forest. Pin looked at these different approaches, either individually or in aggregate, and they really didn't make much of a difference. They didn't boost the number of forest-dwelling species to any great degree. This wasn't a case where you could arrive at kind of a wildlife-friendly landscape with this crop. But a few years later, Singley did find something that works, and works in a very important way, which was riparian buffers. And with a very nice set of field experiments, he showed that if you leave a strip of native forest between the oil palm and any river or stream, you can maintain the diversity, the functional diversity, and the abundance of fish species. And this was a big finding because Southeast Asia has a lot of endemic fish, and buffers not only protect those fish, but they also ensure a supply of fish for the people living downstream, who will often use that as a food source. Lucky events number 2 and 3 happened in relatively quick succession. The first was I hired a talented and sneaky postdoc by the name of David Edwards. I'll get to why I hired him in a moment. Now, the reason I call him sneaky, and I do this with full admiration, is because during his field work, he somehow managed to talk the Sabah logging authorities into giving him a duffel bag with 40 years of logging records from 220,000 hectares of logging concessions. This is in Malaysian Borneo. And with this data, we knew every single tree, its species, its height, and its value taken off of 220,000 hectares, which opened the door to some really interesting economic analyses of the timber industry if I could find an economist, which was lucky break. Number 3, when Brendan Fisher, now at the University of Vermont, joined my group. So Brendan did a number of really neat things with the timber data, but one of his less happy conclusions was that ecosystem services weren't going to save the primary forest. There's a big push, as you know, to value the services that natural ecosystems provide. And of course, our hope was maybe we could show that those services, if properly valued, would justify saving the old growth primary forests, but it really didn't work out that way. So if you look here at the profit in US dollars per hectare from converting a forest by first logging it and reaping the timber value, then converting the site to oil palm and reaping the profits from oil palm, you can see that it typically exceeds what you could get on the carbon market for the timber if you just left the forest alone and sold the carbon stored in that forest, plus some of the other major ecosystem services that might, to some degree, be fungible. So this wasn't a case where we could fall upon ecosystem services as a full justification to protect these forests from oil palm cultivation. Lucky moment number 4, a giant pitta sings. Slightly exaggerated here. So I had mentioned David Edwards. I had been visiting Sabah in the Danam Valley here in Malaysian Borneo, looking at birds there, because I'm really into bird watching and also thinking about potential projects. And David, who was is a phenomenal ornithologist, was taking me around to forests that had been logged to varying degrees, plus the old growth forests. And as we were doing this, and I was seeing and hearing the birds, and David was helping to identify them for me, I was struck that we were seeing an awful lot of birds in the logged forests here. And these are selectively logged forests. They're not clear-cut, but a lot of trees are taken out. And at one point, when we were in a particularly heavily logged forest, a giant pitta sang. And for bird watchers, this is one of the most coveted birds in Southeast Asia. And here it was in a logged forest. And I turned to David and I said, you know, we really have to figure out how this avifauna is responding to logging. Come on board as a postdoc. And that's what brought David to the group. So David and some others designed a really neat experiment where we looked at bird and dung beetle diversity to groups that together are reasonably easy to sample and provide, I think, a fair representation of biodiversity in both the unlogged, old growth or primary forest, once logged and twice logged forests. Now, in this part of the world, with the once logged forests, what happens is they go into the primary forest and they remove all commercially valuable trees with a diameter at breast height, a DBH, of 60 centimeters or more. In these dipterocarp-dominated forests, most of the trees are dipterocarps, most of the dipterocarps have commercial value, so they end up taking out most of the big trees. A few years later, they will go back in, and now they'll take out the commercially valuable trees, 40 centimeters DBH or greater, and that leaves you with a pretty spindly forest of commercially non-valuable species and small trees. Nonetheless, the results, when we analyzed them from our bird and dung beetle surveys, came as a bit of a surprise to me. More than 3/4 of the birds and dung beetles that we found in the primary forests persisted in the twice logged forests. They may not be as common in the log forest as they were in the primary forest, but they were there. And in fact, only 7 to 11% of the species seem to be restricted to the primary forests. I put only in quotes because, I would not be happy to lose 7 to 11% of the fauna of Malaysian Borneo. But on the other hand, it is notable that the vast majority of species are able to persist in the face of logging. And we concluded from that really these log forests are not wastelands. And this was valuable because the attention of most of the conservation community have been quite understandably focused on protecting the primary forests. And there was a tendency to not pay much attention to the forests after they had been logged a couple of times. The assumption being that they really weren't that valuable for biodiversity, and if they were subsequently converted to oil palm, it wasn't that great a loss. But in fact, that was incorrect. Those forests still retained quite a bit of value for biodiversity. So the fact that we had both the faunal surveys and the economic data let us do a little bit of graphing, as it were. And so Brendan could calculate how much timber value, how much the residual timber was worth after one round of logging, after 2 rounds of logging. And so, of course, we'll look at the percentage of the unlogged forest value. So if you have a pristine old growth forest in Malaysian Borneo, at least in our site, it has all of its timber value. That first round of logging targeting the tree 60 centimeters DBH or greater, basically what you're left with is about 40% of the original value. That's how much the residual trees would be worth. You come in again for the second round of cutting, and now you're down to a little over 20%. So a very steep drop off in the residual value of the timber. But we can put on that the response of the birds and the dung beetles, and as I indicated earlier, they have a much less dramatic response. So again, if we just look at species presence, look at all birds, zero in on the understory birds because they're often thought to be the most sensitive, look at the dung beetles, you can see that, again, the drop-off as in forest-dependent species, as you log it once and then twice, is not nearly so steep. And so we advance the argument that this gaping white space here represented, in a sense, an opportunity, that you could protect forests at a much lower price on a per hectare basis, and yet these forests would hold much of the fauna, and hopefully over time, if left alone, would regenerate to be even more valuable for biodiversity. So we advocated that in a number of papers and such. And a couple of years ago, the government of Sabah agreed to protect 400,000 hectares, about 1 million acres of selectively logged forest as strict nature reserves. Now, I will not argue that this was primarily a result of our work, but we do feel, based on conversations with people there in government and in the conservation community, that our work did contribute to this decision, and I felt really good about that. I want to just talk about what we're currently working on related to logging, work that's very much in progress. And it's based on the fact that in Southeast Asia, it's really elsewhere, the timber industry is boom and bust. It waxes and wanes in response to international and economic trends. And of course, the fact is, particularly when we're starting with primary forests, the value of the forest declines as you take more and more timber out. And as a result, from time to time, logging concessions are abandoned. They become inactive. The companies that had the right to log there choose not to exercise it. So not too long ago, the Nature Conservancy approached us and asked the question of whether the phenomenon of logging concessions in Indonesia becoming inactive was good or bad for conservation. And underscoring it was the question in their minds of whether they should be in the business of trying to buy out the inactive logging concessions. Now you might think this has got to be a slam dunk. I mean, if a logging concession is inactive, it means they're not logging it. That ought to be good for conservation. But it's not quite as simple as that, because once the timber company is no longer interested in logging the site, it tends to withdraw its personnel, and there's much less vigilance on the site. And as a result, there is some evidence that oil palm producers can either legally or without permission go onto the site and convert the remaining forest to oil palm. Smallholders, not the big companies, but small private individuals, will do the same. And then there's also an increased risk of illegal logging. So this is one of the topics that one of my postdocs, Zuzana Barivalova, who'll soon be moving to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, was interested in. And so working with the Nature Conservancy, looked at logging concessions in North Kalimantan and East Kalimantan in Borneo, where there is an interesting mix of active and inactive concessions. And what she's doing is using remote sensing to track deforestation over time, over this 15-year period, and looking at the rates of deforestation in active versus inactive concessions, and then trying to correlate what she finds with some of the biophysical features of the landscape, slope, elevation, that sort of distance from roads, that kind of thing. And the goal is to develop a predictive model of which concessions are likely to be deforested in the future, which we can then share with the Nature Conservancy. And her preliminary results are pretty interesting. So to begin with, 17% of the active concessions and about a third of the inactive concessions, so no forest loss. We're just not cutting trees there over that time period, or at least cutting significant amounts of trees. We would not be able to detect sort of single tree removal and such. But if you look at the concessions where there is deforestation going on, it turns out it's quite a bit higher in the inactive concessions. So indeed, there is a reason for the Nature Conservancy to be interested in acquiring the inactive concessions. And so the question that we hope to work with them on is, well, which inactive concessions are both vulnerable to deforestation? There's no need to buy a place that isn't going to be deforested, but are also important for biodiversity. And so Zuzana's model will involve a layer calculating the probability of a concession becoming inactive and being vulnerable to deforestation, and then its suitability for clouded leopards and orangutans, two forest-dependent, very charismatic species that have been very well studied. And so we have a lot of information to go on in terms of how to measure the suitability of forests for these two mammals. In 2012, my research took a new direction. I was on a birdwatching vacation in Sumatra. And I have to say, I couldn't find any pictures of my group in Sumatra. So I went on Google Images, I logged birding Sumatra, came up with this picture, and was horrified to realize this looks exactly like our group. We all wear the same dorky clothing. We've got the same telescopes, cameras, binoculars. It was a little bit embarrassing. But during this trip, one of the things that I noticed is whenever we passed through a village, a small or large village, an astonishing number of homes had pet birds in cages in the front yards. And these weren't budgies and canaries and stuff. These were native birds, including, I might add, species I'd never seen, which really angered me. But it got me to wonder, what is this doing to populations of wild birds? Now, the capture and sale of wild birds is technically illegal in Indonesia, but the law is essentially never enforced. And that's what led me to the issue of the international wildlife trade. So at the end of the trip, I took a day and I went to see the major bird market in Jakarta. And if you can imagine this giant Costco-sized building, and inside of it are dozens and dozens of stalls, and in all of the stalls are dozens and dozens of cages crammed full of birds, almost all of which are wild-caught birds. It was really shocking to me, and I knew that this would be something worth exploring. Now, I had stayed away from the wildlife trade as an issue to work on because it is just an incredibly ugly and unpleasant topic to study, frankly. The wildlife trade, both its legal and illegal components, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In fact, just the illegal component is said by some to rival human trafficking and the narcotics trade in worth. A handful of species, things like tigers, rhinos, elephants, get the bulk of the attention, but it's really a global threat to biodiversity. Thousands of species are involved, all types of taxa from all realms. So it is a big vacuum of wildlife, essentially. And I will argue that it is a subject that desperately needs new insights from the natural and social sciences. It's one that the academic community has been very slow to get involved in, as I discovered. So the Southeast Asian bird trade, as it turns out, exemplifies this broader challenge. There's a huge domestic and international demand for these birds. About 22% of Indonesian households own birds. That's much higher than the rate in, say, the United States. And in fact, in many parts of Indonesia, it's much higher than that. And of the households that own birds, about 60% of them have wild-caught birds. You go into the markets, as I said, you'll find hundreds of species. And most troubling, we have almost no long-term data on wild populations. Unlike the United States or Europe, where you might have a century of Christmas bird count data or a half century of breeding bird surveys, we have none of these long-term data for these birds. Moreover, getting those data is going to be tricky because monitoring wild populations of birds is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it requires specialized expertise. You need people who can identify the birds by both sight and sound. Gratifyingly, the number of bird watchers in Asia is increasing, but it's nowhere near the levels to provide real coverage of the avifauna. So the question that was on my mind was, well, what is the trade doing to bird populations? And in the absence of long-term data, I had the idea that we could try a space for time study. That is, we could sample the songbirds along a remoteness gradient, going deeper and deeper into the forest, away from people, and see if that revealed some interesting patterns. So I was able to convince Bert Harris, who now directs the Clifton Institute, to take on that project. So he set up his research in northern Sumatra on the edge of rebel-held Aceh province, and basically tried to get to the last village in an area with a lot of forest and then go deeper and deeper into the forest. So he and his field crew made it about 5 kilometers in. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is worth noting that in Sumatra, all of the lowland forests have been basically cleared. And to get that far in, you've got to be in some very steep and rugged terrain. So it was a very non-trivial bit of work. So anyways, he got in there, and the idea was we would correlate changes in abundance of the birds as we got farther and farther away from the last village with body size, which we assumed could be a proxy for hunting pressure. The market price, we knew how much the songbirds were selling for. We thought that might be a proxy for the bird trade. And then from the literature, we knew which species were considered forest dependent. And so if there had been habitat change as we moved deeper into the forest, we might be able to use that as a proxy there. And it turned out, we analyzed the data, none of this had any real statistical significance, which for a moment was both disappointing and puzzling. And we thought, well, you know, is it possible that the bird trade isn't having any impact? But we realized that we were probably victims of a shifting baseline here. Bert found evidence of trapping of birds as far in as he could get. The trappers were around. They're friendly people. You can talk to them. And they told him that 5 kilometers, which is as far as he'd gotten in, was the median maximum distance that the trappers traveled when they were on their collecting expeditions to catch birds for the market. And most importantly, the ones he met at his field site said, oh yeah, there used to be a lot more birds here. And in particular, there were species like the Sumatran laughing thrush and the Sumatran silver-eared mesia that are very popular in the marketplace that Bert could find absolutely none of. And the trappers assured him that at that site, just a few years ago, they had been trapping dozens of them. So it really looked like what had happened is they had cleared out the birds as far as Bert could get. And that's alarming because that points to a double hit that these birds are taking from deforestation and trapping. So bear in mind that at least 70% of Sumatra's forests are already gone, converted to oil palm and other agricultural lands. And nearly half of the remaining forests are within 5 kilometers of a major road or village. This was a little bit of a GIS analysis we did. So the green and pink collectively are the remaining forests, and the pink are forests within 5 kilometers of a major road. And that basically knocks out half the remaining forest. Now, at this core scale, what we are unable to map are the minor roads and the small villages and the trails into the forest. So the notion that these birds have even 35% of their habitat left is wildly optimistic. I suspect it's actually down in many cases to just a few percentages, which means that Sumatra's prize songbirds are a lot rarer than we would think if we based our estimates solely on how much habitat they had. So, in a nutshell, that's where we stand. We have too many species that we're worried about, that are being sold in the markets. We have too few field data. We may have too little time to protect a lot of them. We need shortcuts if we're going to address this issue. And so I thought maybe the markets could provide a shortcut. Maybe we could find a way to use data from the markets to figure out which of these birds were really in trouble. And so we devised a project that involved expert opinion and market data, where we found 10 experts who've been birding in Sumatra for a long, long time. And we asked them to assess the population trends for 38 species of birds, and just to bin those 38 species in these categories: severely declining, declining, stable and increasing, unknown. And then we could compare what they said with market price and sales volume data for 32 species. The 6 species that we asked the experts about that don't appear in this list, they're birds that we know aren't sold in the marketplace. People aren't interested in them. And so we wanted to see, well, if the experts said that those 6 species were in trouble, then we might look to some other explanations for declines in Sumatran birds. The experts all agreed that these 6 species were stable or increasing. So the idea was to plot the status of the bird against the 2 variables, its market price and its sales volume. So here the y-axis is whether the price per bird is increasing over time, and the x-axis is whether the number being sold in the markets, the sales volume, is increasing or decreasing. That defines 4 quadrants, of course. I call particular attention to quadrant 1, where the birds are becoming more expensive and fewer of them are appearing in the markets. And quadrant 2, the price per bird is going up, but the markets are still selling more and more of them. Same graph, I've just shifted the axes so I could fit the data I want to show you. Y-axis is the annual % change in the median sales price per bird for a given species. The x-axis is the annual % change in the sales volume. And the interesting thing was that all of the species that the experts said were severely declining, based on just their impressions, clustered neatly in that first quadrant, where their price was going up and fewer of them were appearing in the markets. And the species that the experts thought were declining tended to be clustered, not completely, in the second quadrant, where the price is going up, but the markets are still selling lots of them. And so one of the arguments we've made is that market data may well provide a reliable warning system for identifying overexploited species. If the market price is going up, but the number appearing in the markets is going down, that is a bird that is very likely to be in a lot of trouble. Conversely, if the price is, well, not conversely, but if the price is going up and the markets are still selling lots of them, that bird could be in trouble. We think it probably means that they're scooping them up from a wider and wider radius and bringing them into the major markets. And if the price is declining over time, the bird is probably okay. The cool thing about this is that we can do the market surveys at a much cheaper price than field surveys to get population data on the wild birds. About 1/30th the price of the field surveys. So we think new ways of thinking about the markets and their data is the way to go. Are scientists now paying more attention to the markets? Frankly, it's a little too early to tell. We certainly see some of the conservation groups are upping their surveillance of markets. So maybe this will catch on. I hope so. All right. I then became curious, well, why do people own wild-caught birds instead of captive-bred birds or vice versa? And this was a project that I asked Susanna to work on, as well as Tianming Li, who's now at Sun Yat-sen University, working in the city of Medan, which has a thriving bird market and a lot of people who like to own birds. And so that got us involved in something quite new for us, the social dimensions of the bird trade. We interviewed 762 bird owners in Medan. We asked them which bird species they owned and whether their birds were captive bred or wild caught. Turned out 84% of the bird owners had at least one wild caught bird, and more than half of them had only wild-caught birds. And then we asked them, well, what are your reasons for owning wild-caught versus captive-bred birds? Okay, so some of the survey results. We asked the owners of captive-bred birds why they own a captive-bred bird instead of a wild-caught one, and we want them to own captive-bred birds. It was a little disconcerting that the most frequent answer, logging in at about 45%, was no choice. That was when they went to buy a bird, the only ones that were for sale that they liked were captive bred. A little alarming. And then, oddly enough, about 20% of them said, you know, the captive bred birds have better songs than the wild-caught ones. Okay. So we asked the owners of the wild-caught birds, well, why do you own a wild-caught bird instead of a captive bred one? We got the same answer. Well, I had no choice. When I went to buy the bird I wanted, the only one I could find was wild-caught. Now, actually, that was kind of a positive result. It made us think, well, if they had a choice, maybe they would go for the captive-bred one. And then they also noted that the captive-bred birds were more expensive. So that made us think, you know, if you could get a thriving captive-bred bird industry, you might be able to move some of these people over. Last thing we did was we talked to the owners of wild-caught white-rumped shamas. Now, the white-rumped shama is one of the most coveted songsters of all. And so we asked them, well, why do you own a wild-caught one? Why don't you own a captive-bred one? And we got this answer. 60% of them said, oh, the song of the captive-bred ones is worse than the wild-caught ones. And almost half of them said the quality is worse. They're just not as vigorous or healthy or whatever. And 40% said, oh, I had no choice. I wanted a shaman. The only ones I could find were wild-caught. Well, this question, I was like, really? So we don't have an answer to this, but I do want to give you the results of a preliminary experiment that we did, because we only involved 2 birds. This does not mean much, but we had 2 singing champions, Happy Birthday, who had been wild-caught, and Peller Moss, who had been captive bred, Each was said by the owners to be worth about $30,000. Can't confirm that. We didn't try to buy the damn bird. We had recordings of the song of each. So we did a bit of a blind hearing test with 159 owners. Could they tell which was the song of the wild-caught bird and which was the song of the captive-bred bird? And again, not knowing which was which song did they like better? I'm just curious, a show of hands here. How many of you think that the people, the owners of the wild-caught shamas, can really distinguish the song of a wild-caught shama from a captive-reared one? Okay? And how many of you think they can't do that? Okay. Again, only 2 birds, no real significance here. 63.5% of them guessed correctly. And they also consistently ranked the wild-caught song as slightly better than the captive-bred song. By the way, if there is a Bahasa-speaking undergraduate who wants to do a great senior thesis, we ought to do this with a much bigger sample size of champion birds. Okay, so the question is, can captive breeding programs lessen pressure on the wild populations? Well, some people buy wild birds because they have no choice or because the wild ones are cheaper. So yeah, we might be able to flip some people that way. On the other hand, some people prefer wild-caught birds, and there may be a difference in song quality. Would captive breeding make it easier to launder wild-caught birds? Something we haven't investigated, but we're worried about. And ultimately, jumping ahead, I think the answer to this is not so much wild-caught versus captive-bred songbirds. It's to get people to choose domesticated bird species instead of native ones. So instead of wanting a shama, you want a canary or a budgie or something like that. Final thing I want to talk about is a broader question. Now I will go global. How well do treaties and laws protect wildlife from illegal trade? That's a question we've just been working on with Eyal Frank, a former postdoc of mine, now at the University of Chicago. And we focused on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. This is the most important international law to control the illegal trade in wildlife. So when you read stories of ivory poachers being arrested, or those jackasses who try to smuggle cockatoos in empty water bottles and things like that, these people are getting busted for CITES violations. And CITES is focused on international trade. It has nothing to do with domestic trade. It's been ratified by 183 nations. And it basically protects species by putting them on either of 2 categories. Species put on Appendix 1 are considered endangered by international trade. Commercial trade is prohibited. On Appendix 2, you put species that could become endangered unless international trade is controlled. And that means those species can be exported and imported, but only via a system of permits and that attesting to the fact that the trade has been carefully regulated. So what we did in this project that we just finished was to compare CITES treatment of species with the IUCN Red List. So the IUCN is an international advisory body. It has no legal authority, but through the Red List, it is the most authoritative source of information on the status of species. These are the folks who determine which of the world's species are in threat of extinction, and how endangered they are based on a set of quantitative criteria. So we compiled a list of species that are on the Red List, that the Red List considers critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable, and that the Red List tells us are threatened by intentional capture. We then had to figure out how many of these species are being traded internationally, because for some reason, the Red List would not tell us that. But using other sources, we figured out that about 958 species were being traded internationally and are endangered. And then we asked, fine, how many of these are being protected by CITES? The answer turns out about 72% are protected, 28% of these species are unprotected, and this is the first time that that gap has been identified. On average, it takes CITES about a decade to protect a species after the Red List has declared that species to be threatened by trade. That's problematic because we've seen whole populations of llamas eradicated in 3 to 5 years of trapping. Some species, the helmeted hornbill, for example, went from being mildly threatened to critically endangered in less than a decade when demand grew for this solid protuberance on its skull, which would be carved and sold as red ivory. So our recommendations from this study are that CITES needs to clear the backlog of unprotected species, move faster to protect species threatened by trade after the red list has identified them. Decade is too long. But it's not a one-way street. It turns out that CITES often protect species before the red list, the self-proclaimed authorities, identify them as threatened. So we think the red list needs to pay more attention to CITES as well. And these two critically important bodies need to be in stronger communication with each other. Let me wrap up what I've been saying today, sort of at the biggest level. I've made a pitch for solutions-oriented research. I think it's important and useful. That work, by nature, almost has to be interdisciplinary. And at least for the folks just starting their research careers, I hope I've impressed upon you the wonderful role that serendipity will play in your scientific careers. On the issue of deforestation, I think my main message is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Some of these degraded forests really are valuable for biodiversity, particularly when the alternative is to have them turned into the biological deserts of oil palm plantations and other crops. And on the issue of the wildlife trade, I've tried to make the point that it's a huge, underappreciated threat to biodiversity. It's one that the scientific community can play a huge role. We urgently need fresh approaches to understanding it, to solving it, and once again, interdisciplinary research, particularly on the social science side, is going to be critical. One final comment. So I was returning from one of my trips to Asia when the pilot got on the loudspeaker and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing in Newark Airport in about 25 minutes, blah, 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 blah. We know you have a choice of carriers, and we thank you for choosing United." As you've undoubtedly gathered, nothing that I've talked about could not have happened without the extraordinary group of graduate students and postdocs over the years who've come through my lab. These are really talented people. All of them had a choice of places to go and people to work with, and the luckiest break I ever got was that they chose to work with me. Thank you very much. How would we what? So Andy's question was, how could you put more teeth into something like the CITES? And there, I think what they really should do is they should have an automatic process where if the red list flags something as endangered and notes that trade is a factor, that species should go onto CITES. It has to be voted on by the member parties, but it should come up for an automatic vote. Curiously enough, when it comes to the red list itself, I wouldn't give it any teeth. I think its strength lies in the fact that it's purely informational. Once it had regulatory consequences, a lot of institutions and people would pull away from it or be aggressive towards it. On the other hand, it needs to talk more to CITES. Neither entity has the resources it really needs to do its job as well as it would like. They're getting different types of information. They ought to be talking to each other much more frequently so that they can maximize their ability to do their jobs. Michael.
David, the experience you had with the economic analysis reminds me of sort of the same phenomenon in fisheries. Namely, you see increase in, you can have staple counts for a while because you're getting an increase in activity, the reproduction rates or whatever actually increasing more and more effort, then all of a sudden there's a crash. Did you draw on that literature at all?
We didn't actually, and it would have been, in retrospect or even looking ahead, it would be a good idea to do that because there have been many more economists looking at fisheries than have ever looked at the wildlife trade, and their work is well respected within the regulatory community. But we certainly see a very similar phenomenon with some of these birds, that they're in the markets, their prices are going up, and then suddenly you can't find them in the markets anymore.
Did your data on the once log versus twice log forest allow you to get at intensity of disturbance?
Well, yes, in the sense that we did gather data on the coarse vegetation. We don't have data on like how many times they go in or how many miles of road. So mostly what we know is just that by the time they've gone in for that second round of logging, they've left very little. It's a surprisingly sort of spindly forest of commercially unimportant species. Henry?
I can't decide whether it's a silly question or a profound one, but
it might be a profound question.
no. What are the prospects for taking a bunch of really good shamas, recording them, and then using that as background music in the captive breeding program?
So, when I was a little kid and we had a canary, you could actually buy these little vinyl records that you would play to teach your canary how to sing, which seems ridiculous, but in fact, passerine birds have a template that they then perfect by hearing the sounds of conspecifics. So I actually think that could work. That is, and I suspect the breeders are cognizant of that, and they probably do put the young birds in the presence of a master to kind of improve its song. But we've never done anything to see if that process could erase that slight but nonetheless notable difference in song quality of the wild birds when assessed by people who don't know which is the wild song and which is the captive song.
If listening to the song is one of the main attractions to these wild-caught birds, do you see any feasible alternatives like encouraging planting gardens that would attract wild birds, close to home?
So the question was, okay, if they love the songs, then can we get them to create habitat for these birds? Two thoughts on that. First, some of the coveted songbirds, like the oriental magpie robin, love gardens and backyards and could be there, but you can't find them because they've all been trapped out. So the monetization of the bird seems to exceed the personal delight of having it in your backyard. The second thing is, a lot of these, particularly for shamas, which are becoming quite expensive, they have song competitions. I can actually show you a video where there are dozens of shamas brought to a place and put in cages, and you have judges walking around, and there's this chorus of shamas singing, and all these people yelling encouragement to their shamas, and it seems like utter madness and bedlam to me, but out of that, they will actually pick the winning shamas. And so it's more than just hearing the song, it's being in a competition, and kind of like, synchronized swimming. It's not just, they're like beauty points. How the shama positions itself while it's singing counts. You get points for, a strong posture. It's really a very interesting phenomenon, and it would well reward someone who wanted to dive into it as a sort of a sociological phenomenon.
Just wanted to comment horticulture community out there that probably knows something about
Yeah,
the details of this.
it's true.
And maybe there's a hormonal component or something like that.
Oh, maybe they're drugging the shamas. We never even thought about that. Never even thought about it.
Well, let's thank David again.